Hey there, today I'm pouring a resin cast toilet seat. Here's the top, here's the bottom. I'm using a Easy Cast from Environmental Technologies. I will need rubber gloves, stir sticks, measuring cup, and extra cups for first for stirring and then for double stirring, pouring into. I will also need glitter. I'm probably going to use about an ounce per cup. To determine how much volume these took, I poured cups of water and counted how many it took to fill each one. So first I'll start with the mold release. I just want to spray it in and then wipe it down. Okay, I have my molds ready. I'll be placing them back here. I'm going to mix this in small batches and make sure that the epoxy is very equal. I can't just dump both containers into a bigger container and expect it to be the right proportions, because as you can see they're slightly off. So I will be taking it 2 cups at a time and slowly building up on my mold. Alright, so today I get to pop the toilet seat, the bottom half. I'm super excited to see what it's going to look like. Just kind of breaking the seal a little bit, hoping it goes smoothly. There we go. This is going to be the best toilet seat in all the land. Okay, yay for toilet seats.
Hey, so Dysa finished pouring the glitter toilet seat. It came out beautifully, but there's an edge, so with most molds you're going to end up with a little edge that needs to be knocked down, depending on what, size the project is and depending on how big the knockdown is. You can see right there. You can do it different ways. Sometimes you can even just take a draw knife, like a buck knife, and just kind of at an angle and keeping the same angle, you can kind of just scrape it sometimes. This one here is going to require a little bit more like sanding. So I'm actually going to get out a pad sander. I'm going to put on 320 sandpaper, and I'm going to take it down. The most important thing with this is that you keep the angle the same. You don't want it, for a professional look, you want to keep that angle. So as you're doing the pad sander, you don't want to be rocking it back and forth. You want to just be picking your angle and then following the edge at that same angle. That way you get the same look. Now, when you have sanded epoxy, you have a couple choices. One, you can keep buffing, and you can take it from 320 up to 6, 7, 8,000, 2,000, 3,000, and work your way up and get that polish back. Or you can go ahead and take a little epoxy on a brush and just lightly drag it across. It tends to, put a shine back on there. And the third option is, depending on what it is, you can hit it with a little crystal clear or an epoxy type spray. And it works fine. But for a toilet seat, you're going to be handling it, scrubbing it and cleaning it. So I don't recommend a spray. I recommend either buffing and polishing, which is the best, but lots of work, or two, going ahead and doing the hand-painted epoxy on the edge. So that's what I'm going to do, is hand-paint the epoxy on the edge. And then we'll mount the hardware and we'll show you how to do that. And then we're done. Okay, one more tip for sanding. If you're using anything other than hand sanding, and even with hand sanding, it's a good idea to lay it down on top of cloth. Epoxy can scratch, and it does scratch. So putting it on cloth, when the vibration of this hits it, instead of it getting scratched against the wood or metal or whatever you're doing it on, it's going to be absorbed by the cloth. So recommend putting down cloths, and I have terry cloths down underneath the toilet seat. See that edge? See, it's kind of dull. You can either leave it that way, which is totally acceptable, or you can go and just hand brush right there. Off it goes. I'm going to do the top now, and then we'll move on. Okay, so we're on to the hardware part of the toilet seat. Basically what I've done is taken the old seat off, and I went ahead and used this to figure out how the hardware works. So when you take it apart, study it, or better, use your phone or camera and film it so that you know how the hardware goes together. I know it sounds really simple, but it can actually get a little confusing. So I find it to be really handy to have the old toilet seat here and to have it side by side with the new one. And that way you can see the hardware and you can just really switch it over. Now, sometimes on this case, with this, if your seat's about as thick as the old one, you can do what they did, which is just mount it right on the outside surface. Now, the mold that we used, our base and our top came out much thicker. So we actually went ahead and took a Dremel tool, like so. And let me show you the tip. I used this tip, okay? And I did little notches. I just notched out right here, and then the hardware just kind of sat right into the little troughs that I created. Okay, so, you know, with toilet seats, they're wood. You can just screw right into them, right? Not so easy to do that with epoxy. Sometimes you can screw into epoxy. Sometimes, different epoxies are softer than others. What I like to do is over drill the holes using a drill. And then I set the screw into epoxy that I pour into that hole. So I will drill into the hole, pour epoxy into the hole, put the screw in to the wet epoxy, and then let it set. Don't touch it, just let it set. And that's how I do it. The epoxy will not only go down the hole, but it tends to, when the screw goes in, it tends to spill out and go underneath the hardware. And since I have that little trough right there, it's just going to sit in that trough. And the epoxy is going to not only grab onto the screw, but it also grabs onto the bottom of the bracket. That's the hardware. Okay? So it's okay if you have a little extra epoxy leak out of that screw hole. It'll just grab onto the bracket and make it that much stronger. So I'm going to go ahead and do the process right now of drilling. And then I'll take it up to the other studio, and I will show you the process of setting the actual screws. Not all epoxies are the same, so I like to use the same epoxy for this process as I did for pouring the toilet seat. And the main reason for that is I want to make sure that it bonds really, really well. And if you were to just go out and get one of those little epoxy adhesive blister pack, you know, the ones with the guns, and you push the nozzle down and the two parts of epoxy come out, and you kind of mix them together. Well, yes, it is epoxy, but it might not have the exact same chemical properties as the epoxy that you use for the toilet seat. They do vary. There are other, factors to it. So even though it might be tempting and a lot easier than mixing out what you saw me do, which was this tiny little amount, I highly recommend using the same stuff. That way you get the best bond possible down the holes. And there's a lot of pressure that's put on these little screws. So you want to make sure that you've got a good bond in there. So I'm using screws that are came with the product. They've got some nice heavy duty, screws in there. I'm going to leave those right there. I'm going to go ahead and put my epoxy into the holes and into the trough using a brush, using a little brush here. Don't overfill or you're going to have a mess, but don't underfill because you're putting a lot of pressure on those screws. You got to have a lot of good adhesive in there. I don't know if you can see what I'm doing, but I'll hold it back like that so you can see. I'm putting it in the trough too because I want it to grab onto the bottom of the metal. When I put the screws in, it should push out a little bit. I'm going to push the screws in. And at this point, when I let go, it's going to pull out. That's okay. I'm going to do the second one. When I flop this over, it's going to put the pressure that I need to keep it flat. Okay, here we go. Now, as an added precaution, because goo might come out, I'm going to go ahead and put this piece of plastic over the top. I just don't want the bottom and the top to touch each other, and anything that might ooze out, I don't want it to attach itself to this. So that's what that precaution is. Take a good look to make sure it's in the channels. It is. Sitting nice and flat. We're good. Now it's time for us to do the top hinge. Okay, at this point, there's a lot of slop. So you want to make sure that you've got it even. So reach over and make sure that it's left to right, front to back, the way that you want it to be. Okay, that's the way I want it to be. Now, the one last thing is I'm going to epoxy over the top just as a little added adhesive. Okay, not much more we can do. You're going to let this sit till tomorrow about this time, so 24 hours. And then if we did our job well, it should work perfectly and be ready for installation on your toilet.